My welcome. For those of you who I've not met, my name is Karen Johnston. I'm one of the directors of iTHRIV, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to our Voices in Clinical and Translational Science series. This series is sponsored by the Integrated Translational Health Research Institute of Virginia, or iTHRIV. So the mission of iTHRIV is to catalyze and sustain inclusive clinical and translational research through diverse collaborative team science, innovative data science, and broad workforce development in order to improve human health and promote health equity. The series is aimed at amplifying diverse perspectives in clinical and translational research to foster innovation and inclusive environments. And we highlight our amazing iTHRIV researchers who share with us their research experience and their lived experience. So today, it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Stephanie DeLuca. Dr. DeLuca is an associate professor of pediatrics and the co-director of the Neuromotor Research Clinic as part of the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute at Virginia Tech. Dr. DeLuca's area of research focus is stroke rehabilitation in children. She has helped develop and rigorously test multiple neurorehabilitation therapy protocols and led numerous clinical research trials. Her interdisciplinary research efforts have included engagement of families, international training, and innovative teaching to prepare the next generation of clinicians and scientists. She earned her undergraduate degree as well as a master's degree and her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Alabama. She stayed on the faculty there and became the director of the Pediatric Neuromotor Research Clinic. And in 2019, we were fortunate enough to lure her here to Virginia when she joined the faculty at Virginia Tech. Her research has focused on the development and rigorous testing of neurorehabilitation therapy protocols in clinical trials. And currently, she is the lead investigator on a 13-site phase 3 clinical trial that directs the treatment and implementation core for that trial. She is also a leader in the Medical Rehabilitation Research Resources Network, MR3, which is a center that is designed to improve and increase pediatric rehabilitation trials. So today she will share with us some of her research and her lived experience in her talk, which is entitled Children and Neuromotor Diagnoses, Using Science to Maximize Development. Please join me in welcoming Dr. DeLuca. Thanks for being here, Stephanie.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull up my slides and share my screen, if I can do that, and get started. And technology never does quite what you want it to when you want it to, so give me just a minute. Up. Have to go back to the start of this. I think I'm going backwards. Sorry. I thought I said from the beginning, but I must not have. Okay, am I at the start and can you see everything correctly? I apologize for my technology.
Yep, no, it's totally fine.
My technology woes. When I tested it out, I must have left it at the one slide and then did not hit the appropriate button. But thank you so much for having me. And I think I'm the start off of this series for this year. And so I'm really honored to be here and participate in this. I think this is a very important type of program, and I am just delighted to be a part of it. So thank you so much for the invitation. I want to say that, first of all, everything that I present is, regarding my science, involves a team of people. So this is kind of the core team that is part of the Neuromotor Research Clinic. I also have a number of students, but I didn't have pictures for all of my students, so I thought it was just fair that I just, rather than trying to put in just boxes for a couple and the pictures for one or two that I had, that it might be just fair to say that I had students. I don't think any of the work that I'm going to be presenting was directly led by any students, but I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged all of these individuals because they are really the heart of what happens at our clinic and in the work that we do. And in particular, I want to acknowledge Sharon Ramey here because you mentioned the 13-site trial, which I'm going to briefly mention, but she is actually the primary investigator for that. I'm the site PI for Virginia Tech. These two things also have my primary funding sources. I have funding by the NICHD and the NINDS. Talk first about what I am best known for, which is something called pediatric constraint-induced movement therapy. And you see there on the far right, our particular version of pediatric constraint-induced movement therapy is something we have termed acquire-C therapy. And we've termed it differently because CIMT, or constraint-induced movement therapy, has a long history in the literature for both adults and children. It actually is quite the translational story because it first started with animal work that I was not involved with. As a matter of fact, I came into the picture after the animal work, but right before all the adult trials for CIMT started. I tell everybody I've been involved with this work since before it was called CIMT, which is a long time. So it was in the mid-90s when we were really having discussions about what to call this type of approach that we were trying to put together. But it was based on some animal work, and the animal work actually involved a couple of theories, one in particular that's well known called learn non-use. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I just wanted you to kind of understand the transition of how my focus to pediatric constraint-induced movement therapy came on board. The theories that constraint-induced movement therapy for adults was based on was this concept of learn non-use, and it basically said, and forgive my cartoons because this is just meant to be a really broad overview of what the theory meant, was that after there is central nervous system damage, there is actually a larger portion of the central nervous system that is impacted during the acute phase of the injury. And we know this pretty, through science quite robustly at this point, then is impacted in the chronic stages. So during this acute period, this kind of red circle is meant to represent the acute period, and the orange circle is meant to represent the chronic period. And what the theory of learn non-use said was that, during this acute period, depending on what you're talking about, this was developed for adult stroke patients, so it was particularly aimed at the impaired arm and hand, or the weaker arm and hand in hemiparetic individuals. But it basically said that during this time period, some of the arm and hand may be impacted by this acute damage that isn't there in the chronic period. And during that acute period, there's a lot of unsuccessful motor attempts that basically lead to masked abilities that the individual doesn't take advantage of. And that during the chronic period, you could actually overcome this, some of this suppressed movement, so to speak, with certain training principles. Certain training principles that ultimately became known as constraint-induced movement therapy. And when I came on board, like I first worked with adults, but my goal actually entering graduate school was to develop a similar protocol for children, because very early on in my career, I realized that everything that happens to adults happens to kids. And so children have strokes and have other parts of the things that cause hemiparesis, just like adults. And so I actually entered graduate school. I can remember interviewing with Sharon and Craig Ramey, who were my mentors even in graduate school. And I interviewed with them, said, I want to do this with kids. And I think they kind of said, yeah, well, maybe. And but ultimately, they helped me go through the process. And one thing led to the other. And here I am all these years later. And I've spent a good portion of my career on this particular type of therapy. And we've even published a handbook on this type of therapy, because if you Google constraint-induced movement therapy at this point, you will get nearly 100,000 hits. Now that is not all studies, but it has been a very researched protocol, whether you're talking about pediatrics or adults. And what has happened is there's this myriad of protocols out there, and it's not a standardized protocol. And so one of the things that I've spent my career doing, along with my colleagues, is to try to better operationalize what the componential parts of pediatric CIMT are needed, what's needed actually to make this efficacious. And so one of the things that makes our protocol unique is that we often use a cast for the constraint that you see here in this picture with this little boy. So this is a hemiparetic child who has right-sided weakness, and we have casted his left arm. And so they wear that cast 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We take it off once a week, but we really think the cast kind of redirects the child's attention and does a lot of the work for us to help, take out the behavioral considerations for taking a constraint on and off. We've also, CIMT though, is also always about an intensive dose of therapy. So we've done studies that looked at 3 to 6 hours per day across 4 weeks of treatment. And in older children, we find pretty equivalent results from 3 to 6 hours. But if you go below 3 hours, some recent work suggests that you're going to begin to lose efficacy. So these are very, very intensive epochs of therapy. And then the part that I think we didn't communicate well enough early on when we began publishing about CIMT was that it really involves more than just a high dosage. It really is about a shaping process and operant conditioning and using basic learning principles to help guide the therapeutic process. And in recent years, we've kind of shifted our focus to trying to better disseminate that information and understand how we can make that a big part of how we teach the world how to do this. But I'm going to go back and just tell you that our theories about why this works for children is different than learn non-use too. So when you're working with an adult stroke patient, you are working with an individual who had a pre-established set of neural connections that represented whatever you're targeting, in this case, movement. But if you're working with a child who maybe had a stroke in utero, you are actually trying to develop a whole new set of neural representations that, the learning processes may be similar, but it's not the same as trying to encourage reconnections of neural pathways that were previously established. It's about developing pathways. And of course, we believe in part that cortical organization is use dependent. And so what happens with these children is they have early CNS damage, again, sometimes in utero, and they still are impacted by learning. So there's a lot of maybe attempts at even spontaneous and reflexive action that normally is reinforced, maybe in infancy, that does not get reinforced. And so these lead to failed attempts. And ultimately, you end up with something we term developmental disregard that actually redirects and re-emphasizes children to use their supposedly unaffected upper extremity because they really learn to redirect all their attention to that unaffected upper extremity, although we firmly believe that there's no truly unaffected upper extremity or extremity in hemiparesis. So even though it looks like there's one side of the body that is very functional, really both sides always have some limitations. And I think that is that's something we don't recognize often enough. So as I said, though, if you're talking about children, you're really talking about a different process than with adults. So we've come up with, and I said we've spent a lot of time trying to better define what we do and put it in the context of learning. And we have developed a framework that, really you could take this framework as it stands, and you could say that you are doing this even in an adult interaction. This is a framework that's meant to describe a moment-by-moment interaction during each therapeutic interaction. So you have movements that are either random or encouraged. Part of the shaping process, part of the operant conditioning process is to then reinforce. You provide reinforcements that might be verbal or tangible. You encourage individuals to repeat those, and you encourage the refinement, so that refinement towards whatever your goal is. The big difference with children is that you have to always put this in the context of play. So, when I worked with adults, we could develop certain things. An individual might say they wanted to work on eating, and so we could work on picking up a fork, and we could, be very precise about this. We could, see how long it took a person to take 2 bites with a fork, and we could do timers and things like that and say, okay, you did that in 20 seconds. Let's see if next time you can do it in 10 seconds. And we could try to progress things very systematically. Well, you can't really do that with kids. You've got to keep them engaged, and you've got to keep them moving forward, but it all has to be in a context of play, and it all is meant to be a positively reinforcing process, which is much harder than it looks like on paper. This framework is a pretty picture, but there's a lot of work that goes into each and every moment. And when you think about the intensity part of it, that means that therapists have to keep children engaged for many, many hours a day, every day. But this, series is really about, as you all mentioned, trying to raise underrepresented voices, and creating partnerships and talking about different lived experiences. And so I think one of the reasons I was invited, and I'm thrilled to be here, is because if you know me, one of the things you'll notice is that I have an unusual gait. I wear bilateral AFOs. I don't mind talking about it. I am 30 plus years post what was termed Guillain-Barré syndrome that left me with some residual effects. I'm told now that my presentation would not truly be Guillain-Barré. It would be some other acute global neuropathy, because I didn't present quite in the same way that Guillain-Barré is defined today, but none of that matters. But it is, in fact, one of the things that introduced me to rehabilitation, right? So I went through rehabilitation myself as a very young adult. And when I tell you I fell through every crack in rehabilitation, I can tell you some horror stories. And in fact, those horror stories are probably what made me think I was going to run from rehabilitation. If you would have asked me when I went back to school if I would have worked in rehabilitation, much less be doing it 30 years later, I would have emphatically told you no. I did not intend to be here. It wasn't my goal. I felt like the system was broken, and I did not want to participate in it. However, it did give me a unique perspective on the system. And the short story, my short origin story is Ed Taub, who was the first person that put forward the idea of learn non-use, hired me in his lab with actually to do biofeedback. And then he got some grant funding. And as I said, the story kind of goes from there. One grant led to the next. And so I've tried to build on that unique perspective, though, throughout my career and help it inform my own science. With a disability, but I'm also a person with many abilities, but sometimes it's hard when you have a lived experience to disentangle these. It's hard to disentangle these from the outside, for the outside person looking in, but it's even hard for the person, myself, to disentangle these from an internal perspective. And I'm not going to really talk much about ableism for myself, but I would direct you towards a clinic that is hosted April 27th and 28th that's put on by NICHD. I encourage you all to be there. I will be there. I'm not a speaker, but I look forward to participating. I think it's important that we keep raising the voices of this process, and so I wanted everybody to have that information. What I am going to tell you, though, is I think ableism is a part of many aspects of my career. And I also think that there's even another type of ism, although I don't know what to call it, that has impacted my career. And that's this disconnect between science and clinical practice. Someone told me once I was a clinician at heart. They actually told me I was an OT at heart. But in fact, I have a PhD. I am not a clinician. And I think the fact that there's a disconnect, clinicians sometimes disregard scientists, and scientists sometimes disregard clinicians. And I think that that ism, whatever you want to call it, has also impacted my science, and it's made its own set of struggles. And I wanted to be brave enough to bring that forward as we talk about some of the difficulties in this process. Because in either case, there's been many times, whether you're talking about ableism with my disability or even my science and clinical practice disconnect, I've often want to say, hello, I'm still here and you need to talk to me if you have an issue. And I'm willing to bet that many people feel that same way. But I also wanted to say that the reason it's hard is because, these are pictures that have all occurred in my life in the last 2 years. And if you look at these pictures, you could probably make a lot of assumptions about me, just like you can make a lot of assumptions about my abilities or disabilities based on the pictures you saw of AFOs. But the fact is, you would make some correct assumptions and you would make some incorrect assumptions based on these pictures. And I think that that's the real take-home message about ableism, is we need to talk and we need to ask, because it's those incorrect assumptions that cause us problems. But science also, as I said, has its own set of issues. I mean, science is tough, right? I mean, I found a couple of cartoons. This one says most scientists regard the new streamlined peer review process as quite an improvement, but you see they really feel like they're going to get beat up as they go towards that paper. You could put grant at the end of that. I mean, here's another cartoon that says, is it just me or these review panels getting a lot tougher? I mean, I think science is tough and it's a tough process to go through. But the other thing I wanted to point out, even about these cartoons, is that the homogeneity of the samples is not the only thing that needs to be discussed. I mean, in this picture, we don't have a lot of heterogeneity in who's doing the beating up or even who's doing the submissions, right? I mean, I think there is problems with heterogeneity across the board in science at all levels. And I think it leaves people that have different lived experiences, again, wondering when and how they can say, hello, listen to me. But I stay at my science and I keep going with this because of people like this, children like this. These are the faces that matter. These children, their abilities and disabilities did not define them either. But, I think every child has the right to maximize their development. And that's why I do why I try to keep doing what I'm doing. The other thing I want to say to you is we don't have a lot of good evidence about pediatric rehabilitation. In 2013, only 16 of 64 rehabilitation treatments were judged worthy of recommending based on evidence. Now, constraint-induced movement therapy was one of those 16, and it was actually produced the largest benefits and had the most rigorous scientific evidence. But 30 to 40% of the interventions that are currently used had no evidence-based effort. And this is just a pictorial representation of that. But this was in 2013. We have many gaps in knowledge, and I would dare to say that, unfortunately, the picture hasn't changed all that much, and it's been 10 years. So why does it take so long? I said I worked with this first little girl in 1998. We worked with her twice. She was 15 months of age. She's now in her 20s, right? That's a long time. Again, I would have never guessed if you would have asked me. I have directed 2 data-driven clinics, one at UAB, as it was mentioned, and one at VT, which was established in 2013. And we in that have always collected data, and we can show that our clinic data actually matches many of our clinical trials. You know, if you look at this clinical data on the far left there of this graph, it is less than the amounts of change you see in the clinical trials, but that's kind of to be expected because it's a more heterogeneous population. Still, these are pretty big change scores on something called the emerging behavior scale. And these and our parents report that this really impacted their children's lives. I'm going to briefly show you a couple of videos. I've had the honor of working with others, Dr. Patty Coker-Bolt and Sharon Ramey, internationally, and I'm going to show you what CIMT results look like. This is a little boy who has a brachial plexus injury actually, and you can see his left side involved, and he pretty much wants to ignore it. I'll let it play, and that's pre-treatment, pre-CIMT, and I'm going to let you see it post. See his left arm, and I think a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? I mean, you can see the willingness of this child to be able to do this. And, you know, I mean, that's a pretty dramatic difference if you just watch them play side by side. But I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm going to show you one more example in Vietnam. This is a little boy. I don't know why all my videos happen to have left-sided hemiparesis, but you can see he's trying to take on and off a shirt. Pre-treatment, and then you can watch post-treatment, how he's using his left hand. And my first reaction when I saw this video was, well, the items are different, right? I'm a good scientist. You know, are they a little easier? Right, but I think in a few minutes, she's going to put on the same shirt. And you're going to, I hope you agree that he does it a lot more fluidly and easily. And so I always think a picture's worth 1,000 words. And these are why I keep at my science, right? Recently, I don't have any video, but Mary Rebecca Trucks actually took this to Trinidad as well and has trained some therapists there. So I am proud of that work. And she just found out that that a presentation on that work was accepted at the American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine in the fall. So I want to congratulate her on that. But all of this work, you know, 20 years and it's still not standard of care. Why not? Well, I think ableism is a part of the problem. And I'm really giving my own experiences in science. I think, you know, ableism about the population I serve and the populations I seek to serve, even lower functioning children we've tried to work with in more recent years. I think it's hard for review panels. I think it's hard for clinicians to really think about them changing, if I'm honest. And I think that by definition is ableism. And I think that has impacted our ability to get this disseminated across the globe. But I also think that the very idea that we haven't standardized the protocol is an issue. So what I would say, though, is that people with lived experiences, you know, it's important to think about their perspective. It's important to think about it from the scientist perspective, but also the people we serve. You know, we talk a lot about the mistrust in science being a communication issue, but I also think it's about this ivory tower that we construct. You know, it's about this process of we just study things and we don't think about how to disseminate them, or we don't think about the things needed to disseminate them. And that's a problem in science. Science will really thrive if we have a diversity of perspectives across levels. And that includes you know, building people in with lived experiences in our target population, but also thinking about who we even let into the science academia process. I think even everything we do needs to be rethought and to some degree. So what do? Well, personally, I plan to keep trying to serve children and families through my science. I keep, you know, even though I get frustrated, I keep putting forward studies. And I'm going to keep trying to convince people that the pediatric rehabilitation system needs an overhaul because I firmly believe it does. And in the words of John Lewis, I hope I caused good trouble by speaking up. I mean, but in truth, venues like this, while I applaud them, they're hard. They're hard if you have a different lived experience. You feel a bit at risk. And I can honestly say I wasn't sure some of the items that I should or shouldn't put in here. But, you know, I'm also at a point in my career where I said, well, what the heck? I'm going to call it out if I see it. And but I think when you're early on in your career, particularly if you have a lived experience, you know, venues like this are hard, and it's hard to speak up against the system. And I think we have to speak up against the system. I think our science has to change across all levels. That means review processes, funding processes, and even the gates about who we let into the process need to change. Because that means, though, that we have to change our teaching processes and meet individuals where we're at. Current recommendations for CIMT include that they should have high dose therapy. So we have made some changes, and that's good news. And that's all these couple of articles were meant to show you. With this one was in 2021. And in 2023, just recently, CIMT again was recommended. So we've made some better progress, but there's still a lot to do. And I think some of the problems with, again, recommendations and making it standard of care is that it's not always the same. You know, we don't know who should make recommendations in rehabilitation. As I said, we put forward in 2013 a handbook, but it didn't become standard of care. And I think we still need to learn many things about CIMT, particularly for this trial that was mentioned. We do have the first ever phase 3 trial called iTHRIV in pediatric rehabilitation that is comparing 3 to 6 hours dosage of CIMT. And I think that's a big step forward. This trial is funded by StrokeNet, but it is important to acknowledge that it is the first ever phase 3 clinical trial pediatric rehabilitation. So we're hopeful that it goes a long way in changing the process. But I also go back to this because one of the things we've learned about the iTHRIV trial is that we need to better standardize CIMT. We need to standardize its application and its dissemination. And along with that, we have to learn how to train therapists to do this process systematically. And we have to quit thinking about training as a one-off process that people come and they just to a one-time training process and they are forever trained in a given technique. We have to go beyond just the idea of continuing education credits every once in a while. Training for therapists needs to be an iterative process that is followed across time. And we're actually doing that in the iTHRIV trial. And I hope it will lead to some training modules that we can set up long-term to help the whole system learn how to create iterative processes for pediatric rehabilitation. We also have something called the National Pediatric Rehabilitation Research Center, which is an entity that is aimed at educating and mentoring future pediatric rehabilitation processes. I encourage you to go to the website and look there because there are pilot funds every year that we provide to pediatric rehabilitation individuals. And then with my own personal science, we've been working with trying to develop what we do with the acquire process and develop it for other etiologies. This is a family that recently we had a lot of news stories on that in collaboration with Dory Wallace, a colleague here, we've developed this for children with microcephaly. And we've also began to look at various diagnoses in our clinical samples. So this is on that same scale you saw previously, a pre to post, and you can see the various diagnoses of children that we've seen clinically in that sample. This is a sample of about 130 children, I believe. And if you collapse across that so that we're working with children who are hemiparetic and quadriplegic, so the individuals with quadripresis would not have always had the cast, so they're just doing the intensive therapy epics, you can see that they continue to improve as well. And that standardization of the learning modules, I think, is one of the things that we need, that again, we need to better develop so it can go out to other etiologies. It's not just about the constraint, it's about this learning process. But if you're a scientist, there's always things that that plague you. There's always things questions that, you know, we say that science answers one question and leads to many more. And I think there are still questions about the constraint that I have. So this was a recent study. You can see we compared high dose CIMT to a more moderate dose. And we compared two types of constraint, full-time constraint to part-time constraint. So the cast was worn, as I described earlier, or there was a constraint that was a splint that was taken on and off just during therapy. And the conclusions of that study was that dosage matter. Okay, so the kids in the high dose compared to the moderate dose, both at the end of treatment and 6 months, you know, they did better than the lower dosage and better than UCT. So that was what you see here, that was the primary conclusion. But if you follow that out, and this is unpublished data, what you see at the end of treatment and 6 months later is that there, you know, it didn't appear that the constraint type mattered. But what intrigued me and still intrigues me is that if you follow those children out to 12 months, the cast versus the splint almost shifts entirety to where it's now borderline significance. And so it's questions like that that continue to make me wonder if the constraint type might matter. And in fact, in that same sample, if you look at their particular measure of grasp, and you look at the cast and the solid lines to the splint at 12 months, you know, these are the types of questions that lead to the next grant application. These are the types of questions that oh, what's going on here? So it's always those unexpected findings that drive you crazy if you're a scientist. And I can tell you that similarly, we have, I'm not going to go into the data with this, but we also, the study I just presented was from children 2 to 8. We also have similar findings that suggest that the full-time constraint might have a unique impact on children under 2. And that is being currently written up. So it's kind of intriguing. I'm going to leave you that hanging to be looking for that article. But my take-home message would be that people with all types of lived experience are really your community, and they must be a part of science at all levels. And that's really the message I want everyone to go home with. The noblest pleasure is the joy of understanding. Leonardo da Vinci said that. And with that, I will end this and open it up for questions.